You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hello, ako po si Robbie Alampay, Puma Podcast. In this episode of Teka Teka, we're talking about China's campaigns in the South China Sea, not just to control the area defined by what it calls the Nine-Dash Line, but to control the narrative around that campaign. How Beijing is trying to shape how China and how everybody else, the Philippines included, is perceived within our own communities and in the global arena. In the middle of May, a Filipino civilian-led campaign organized a flotilla of about 100 small fishing boats. They set sail for Scarborough Shoal in the West Philippine Sea. This mission, organized by the non-government coalition Atinto, aimed to push back against China's claim over the area and to assert Philippine rights over what has been internationally recognized as within its exclusive economic zone.
And the global community has already stood up behind us.
Just before the flotilla set off, journalists and groups monitoring social media noted a surge of what looked like Chinese propaganda.
This is an attempt to malign the legitimate activities.
On Twitter, there were claims that the Filipinos intended to provoke an incident.
The Philippines plans to stage a conflict near Huangyan Island.
For example, there was this conspiracy video posted on the eve of the Atinto campaign.
Upon their arrival, the fishermen begin deliberately falling into the water and hassling the routine patrols.
We reached out to Tim Niven, research lead at DoubleThink Lab.
It's all staged for the cameras.
To help us understand how information and control of narrative fits into China's objectives in the South China Sea, Tim discussed with us what they call Beijing's narrative warfare and the broader concerns over what they tagged as foreign information manipulation and interference, or FIMI.
So my name is Tim Niven. I am the research lead at DoubleThink Lab. DoubleThink Lab is a civil society organization based in Taiwan, and our mission is to defend democracies against attacks in the information space by conducting monitoring files and space for foreign information manipulation and interference, or FIMI.
I started our conversation by asking Tim about that video that you just heard. Is this something new, or is this something typical of what they've been monitoring coming out of China?
Yeah, I think in general, this kind of tactic is not new. The one example I'm thinking of is recently in Taiwan, there's been a lot of controversy around a proposed law, and which has involved tens of thousands of people protesting. As part of information manipulation tactics, if you are proposing to send thugs into a protest to cause trouble, then one of the things you would do before you do that is to claim that your opponent is going to send thugs to the event. What we're talking about is narrative warfare, trying to get your story out first and to get it spread as far and wide appears to be the goal.
This particular content was in English. Who is the audience for that content? Are they playing to their own people, or is this content directed at, in this particular case, Filipinos, or for that matter, the English-speaking world?
FIMI can be used to support all kinds of tactical objectives, both long-term and short-term. In terms of target audience, based on the information you're giving me, it's a little bit difficult to distinguish between Filipino versus international. But as you rightly point out, the fact that this content is in English means that it is targeting either or both.
We're aware of what we can understand from where we're sitting. But is FIMI, does it also call for strategies and tactics that are facing to the Chinese public? In other words, how is China controlling its narrative with its own people, with regards, for example, to the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea?
Yeah, good question. So internally to the PRC, the information control system is fairly comprehensive. If there are narratives that the CCP does not approve of, they will be censored inside the PRC. And obviously the narratives that the CCP would like to have spread will be spread far and wide. There's been one estimate that there are 20 million people internal to the PRC that have been tasked to create propaganda in their internal social media environments for public opinion management. It's been described as I think, accurately described the internal PRC information environment as a giant QAnon. It's a massive conspiracy theory community. Obviously, it's not total. There's lots of people inside the PRC that will be able to jump the Great Firewall and find other information. There is definitely dissent within the PRC, but generally speaking, it is a very comprehensive.
You mentioned a keyboard army of 20 million people, little less than 2% of their population. How about in terms of actual social media accounts?
Yeah, I think you could probably say at least 20 million. Now, that will be internal. When you're talking about external, international facing, the estimate is about 2 million. Now, that's human operators. On social media, you can automate things. There's also, it's very important to mention, there's also influence for hire. It's actually a commercial practice. PR firms, other companies, they will create fake social media accounts. They will develop them to a certain level of maturity, and then they'll sell them to actors like the CCP. They can then use them. For example, they tweet in Indonesian for 2 years and then in Indian for 3 years, and then CCP buys the account and starts tweeting in Chinese and attacking Taiwan and the Philippines and stuff.
Well, that's huge. But could you speak a bit about the methodology? How do we even arrive at that kind of an estimate?
Historically, we've really relied on the platforms to do this work and to publish their results, because the platforms can see data that open source researchers like us, we cannot see. For example, IP addresses. The platforms can see this coordinated and authentic behavior. They can see the data and then they can attribute it to an actor, in this case through IP addresses. So by studying the tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, we kind of get like a behavioral fingerprint, you could say. Now, the forensic indicators, let me give you some examples. Some very classic ones that you can find on Twitter. We have actually often AI-generated profile pictures of attractive women that post way too many tweets in a day. We have them posting in business hours in Beijing. We have coordinated account creation and operation. So one person will log into Twitter and create an account and then log into another and create another account in serial. They'll retweet the same people. They'll reply to the same people. They'll often copy-paste messages across each other. For investigators like me, these are very simple, very straightforward indicators that actually platforms should be able to automatically shut down. Now, as you know, in the past, Twitter had a trust and safety team, and they used to do this work and they used to publish. But since they dismantled that team, unfortunately, it's a cesspool now. This kind of accounts just run rampant, and there's just no policing of it, pretty much.
Could you speak a bit about the non-digital and more traditional platforms and implementations of this information warfare?
So that's a great question. People often wonder about the effectiveness of these kind of large-scale, obviously fake and spammy accounts. But what is obviously more impactful is the traditional media, the local traditional media. So we've had examples in Taiwan where there's been what looks like collaboration between CCP and local journalists and editors. So you might be you might be familiar with the biolabs trope. It's a conspiracy theory that was put forth by the Russian state media. And I think at one point in history, pretty much every country in the world, Russian state media have claimed as a dangerous biological weapons laboratory run by the US and the local government together. Taiwan got its biolabs conspiracy last year, thanks to a local journalist who claimed to have a whistleblower who's revealed documents. Well, won't be able to know who the supposed whistleblower was, but the documents were highly questionable and used language that was more like PRC Mandarin than Taiwan Mandarin, similar to the way that, New Zealand and America have slightly different English. So this kind of a story is very impactful because it arrives in very trusted local mainstream media. So basically, it's been discovered that local mouths are far more convincing than foreign mouths. And so borrowing local mouths for CCP messaging is a very impactful and concerning tactic.
This is something that you've monitored for other countries. I mean, so many national elections all over the world, including Indonesia, Philippines coming up in 2025 for national and local elections. Has there been any kind of monitoring on those fronts?
Yeah. Unfortunately, this is a phenomenon that's global in scale and spread. Wherever the CCP has strategic interests, they will use information manipulation. One of the challenges of this tactic is that the relationships are offline by nature and therefore a lot more obscure. They often don't leave the same kinds of online traces as fake accounts on social media platforms. However, sometimes they do. For example, I'm thinking of a case study we did in Japan, a Japanese guy that was running a Chinese language news website, and the guy that established that company was actually an immigrant from PRC, but he would write in Chinese social media boasting about the things that he was doing in Japan. And so actually there's a really rich source of knowledge because people that do this kind of work for the CCP kind of also need to get credit for it. And then you actually find them boasting about it. But generally speaking, apart from this kind of thing, these kind of offline tactics are obscure to us. So what we often find instead is we find these stories like the Taiwan biolabs, which look highly suspicious, but we don't have the smoking gun evidence. This creates a dilemma, particularly for open societies, where you don't want to say somebody that has pro-CCP views. Well, you're allowed to have pro-CCP views. It's an open society. So it's really a difficult question how to address this kind of tactic.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. We also don't want to paint everyone with a wide brush. But one thing that is clear also are at least relationships can be very overt and in fact even very official. Certainly during the time of President Duterte, the coziness and the comfort and even the sucking up to China was very explicit and very official. That also therefore played into a relationship where China was providing media development support and journalist training to Philippine journalists, and for that matter, Philippine government-run media. Should we treat that as innocuous? I mean, other governments provide the same trainings, or is this part of something that we should be mindful of?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's also a great point that these relationships are often very, very open. I think it's obviously problematic, but it's not obvious to me what the answer is. The FIMI framework, very rightly, in my view, doesn't want to be about narratives. And that's because it needs to be free speech respecting. But ultimately, we are engaged in narrative warfare. That's what we're doing. It's, the CCP has their narrative warfare, and they have some local collaborators that they are coordinating with in this narrative warfare, and we need to fight back against these narratives. So I feel that to an extent, we also need to be paying attention to this, putting our message across.
Given that a lot of these things are not within the control of citizens. What can we nonetheless do as citizens in terms of being aware, in terms of fighting back, or even just in terms of being information resilient?
It's generally accepted that being aware of various manipulation tactics is something of an inoculation against them. So seeking out media literacy, supporting local journalism, paying attention to your fact-checking organizations, think before you share, stop before you share. Counter messaging, we just touched on. Removing inauthentic asset networks, obviously. I do agree with labeling state media. I would even agree with labeling content from people that have established links to state media, to PRC, to CCP. Yeah, pretty much. Those are the...
Tim Niven of DoubleThink, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka. Muli, ako po si Robbie Alampay, Puma-podcast. If you like the work that we are doing with Teka Teka, please do tell your friends about us. Subscribe to and follow Puma-podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, o kung saan man kayo Puma-podcast. You can also follow us on YouTube. This episode was written by myself and Pinoy Blanco helped me in the production. Maraming salamat po.